Think modern dating is complicated? Try falling in love when a simple hello could get you excommunicated, and your parents are literally negotiating your marriage like a livestock auction. Medieval romance wasn't just different. It was a sophisticated system of secret codes, forbidden letters, and elaborate courtship rituals that make today's dating apps look like child's play. We're talking about an era where 90% of marriages were arranged. Love letters could be considered heresy, and touching someone's hand required a legal contract. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Some of the most passionate love stories ever recorded happened in this supposedly loveless time, and the methods people use to find true love will blow your mind. From 12th century French courts to English villages in the 1400s, we're diving into a world where romance was rebellion, and love was literally a matter of life and death. These medieval dating strategies are actually going viral on TikTok right now, with Gen Z calling them the original slow burn romance. And honestly, they might be onto something. So buckle up, because you're about to discover why medieval lovers had game that would make modern romantics jealous, starting with the most dangerous love letter ever written. You think texting someone, "What are you doing?" at 2 a.m. is awkward? Try imagining having to marry someone you've never met, just because their family owns the fattest cow in the village. Welcome to medieval romance, where finding love wasn't about butterflies in your stomach. It was about land rights, livestock negotiations, and hoping your future spouse had most of their teeth. Picture this. You're standing in a drafty stone castle, maybe shivering in a medieval village, wondering how to strike up a conversation. Maybe compliment someone's stockings, ask if they come here often, slip them your number carved into a piece of bark. Nope, that's not how any of this works. If you're living in the Middle Ages, dating in the modern sense doesn't exist. You don't swipe right, you don't slide into DMs, and you definitely don't go on long walks to see where things go. Instead, your parents, your lord, or your local abbot are already deciding who you'll marry, when you'll marry them, and exactly how many cows it'll take to seal the deal. The medieval world was a place where survival trumped romance every single time. Forget about compatibility questionnaires or checking if you have the same taste in music. This was an era of plagues, famines, and wars where people died young and died often. In this harsh reality, marriage wasn't about finding your soulmate. It was about securing alliances, combining resources, and ensuring your family line didn't end with you freezing to death in a ditch somewhere. Love was a luxury most people couldn't afford, and frankly, it was considered dangerous to the social order. If you were born into nobility, congratulations. Your romantic fate was probably sealed before you could even walk properly. You and your future spouse might have been betrothed since childhood. Your marriage contract signed while you were still learning not to drool on yourself. Your wedding day might literally be the first time you lay eyes on each other, which is exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. And this wasn't about whether you'd make each other laugh or share the same life goals. This was about land, titles, and family alliances. Your marriage was essentially a corporate merger, except instead of stock options, someone was trading sheep. But let's say you weren't born with a silver spoon and a predetermined spouse. If you were a peasant, things were slightly less formal, but only slightly. Your family still had a massive say in who you'd marry, and love wasn't really part of the conversation. Maybe your parents knew a nice girl whose family owned a particularly productive goat. Maybe they admired a boy who could thatch a roof without falling off and breaking his neck. Boom, you're courting now, lucky you. Romance was practical. You didn't marry someone because they made your heart skip a beat. You married them because they could help you survive the winter. The young woman in this world finds herself caught between childhood and a marriage arrangement she had no voice in choosing. She wakes up in her family's modest stone house to discover that her father has been negotiating with the blacksmith's family about her future. She's 15, maybe 16, and her entire romantic destiny is being decided over ale and handshakes between men who view her as a walking investment opportunity. Her mother explains matter-of-factly that marriage isn't about feelings. It's about survival, security, and hopefully producing children who won't die before their 5th birthday. Meanwhile, the young man in this scenario isn't much better off. He might have fallen for the miller's daughter, but unless his family can offer something valuable in return, land, tools, a decent plow, or at least a cow that gives milk consistently, he might as well be in love with the moon. His romantic dreams crash against the cold reality of medieval economics. Love letters are nice, but nothing says husband material, like owning 2 healthy oxen and a roof that doesn't leak when it rains. The conflict here isn't just personal, it's generational. These young people are caught between their natural human desire for affection and connection, and a social system that treats marriage like a business transaction. They watch their parents negotiate their futures like they're trading livestock, because in many ways, that's exactly what's happening. The tension builds as they realize that their feelings, their preferences, their dreams of romantic love are completely irrelevant to the adults making decisions about their lives. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite all the rules, despite all the family pressure and social expectations, people still fall in love. Human nature doesn't care about property lines or family alliances. So you get these beautiful, tragic moments where a young person locks eyes with someone across a market square, feels that spark of attraction, and then realizes it might as well be a spark from a dying fire. Because unless their families are on equal financial footing, unless the numbers work out on both sides, that spark will never be allowed to grow into a flame. The climax of this particular story comes when our young woman realizes the full weight of her situation. Standing in her family's kitchen, watching her mother count coins and livestock to determine her market value, she understands that in this medieval world, love might be the goal of poets and dreamers, but marriage is the work of parents, priests, and politics. She's not a person choosing a partner. She's a commodity being exchanged. The romance she's dreamed about, the connection she's yearned for, the idea that someone might choose her for who she is rather than what she brings to the transaction. All of that belongs to fairy tales, not real life. Yet as she accepts this reality, something interesting happens. She doesn't give up entirely. Instead, she begins to adapt, to find small ways to assert some control over her destiny. She starts paying attention to the negotiations, learning to read people, understanding that even in this constrained world, there might be ways to find happiness, or at least contentment. She realizes that while she can't choose whom to marry, she might still have some influence over how that marriage unfolds. The resolution comes with a kind of resigned hope. Our young woman accepts that she'll marry the blacksmith's son, not because she loves him, but because it makes sense for both families. But she also begins to understand that love might still be possible. It just might come after marriage, rather than before. She's heard stories of couples who grew to care for each other over time, who found affection in shared struggles and mutual respect. It's not the passionate romance of troubadour songs, but it's something real and human, and potentially beautiful in its own way. As this first chapter closes, she's sitting by her window looking out at the village, knowing that somewhere out there, other young people are facing the same impossible choice between heart and necessity. But she's also beginning to suspect that the human heart is more resilient than anyone gives it credit for. Even in a world that treats love as a luxury, people find ways to love. They just have to be more creative about it. And maybe, just maybe, there are other ways to find romance in a world that doesn't officially believe in it. The stage is set for a deeper exploration of how people in impossible circumstances still manage to find connection, affection, and yes, even love. Because while marriage might be the work of parents and politics, the human heart has always been wonderfully disobedient. So you think someone's cute? Maybe it's the way they balance a basket of onions on their head without dropping a single one. Maybe it's the confident way they beat mud off a rug like they're conducting a symphony orchestra. Your medieval heart skips a beat, and for a moment, you think this might be it, true love at first sight. But hold on there, Romeo. Before you even think about courtship, you better ask yourself one crucial question. What do I bring to the negotiating table? And if your answer is a charming personality and really nice eyes, well, you might want to sit down and rethink your entire approach to romance. Welcome to the harsh reality of medieval economics, where love was lovely, but livestock was essential. In this world, romance didn't bloom without a detailed financial assessment. Every potential relationship came with an invisible price tag, and if you couldn't afford the entry fee, you might as well fall in love with a cloud for all the good it would do you. This wasn't because people were heartless or materialistic by nature. It was because survival in the medieval world required constant calculation, and marriage was the biggest investment most families would ever make. Picture the agricultural society that dominated medieval life. Your wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or investment portfolios. It was counted in acres of farmland, heads of cattle, and tools that could help you not starve to death. Land was everything because land produced food, and food kept you alive through brutal winters and unpredictable harvests. If your family owned fertile soil, you were golden. If they owned rocky, barren ground that couldn't grow weeds, let alone crops, your romantic prospects were about as promising as that barren ground itself. If you were a young man hoping to marry, you needed to prove you could provide. That meant owning land, or at least having access to it through your family. It meant having livestock, cows for milk, oxen for plowing, sheep for wool, pigs for meat. It meant possessing the tools necessary for survival: plows, hammers, axes, looms. Love letters might make someone's heart flutter, but nothing said husband material quite like 2 healthy oxen and a roof that could survive a mild thunderstorm without collapsing on everyone inside. But here's where it gets complicated for the second son, the one who won't inherit the family farm. If your older brother gets the land and the good livestock, and all you're left with is a rusty plow and maybe a goat with attitude problems, your options become severely limited. You might consider the priesthood, which at least comes with guaranteed meals and a dry place to sleep. Or you could try to make your fortune as a craftsman, soldier, or merchant, assuming you survive long enough to build up any wealth worth mentioning. For young women, the economics were even more brutal. Your family needed to provide a dowry, essentially a payment to your future husband's family to make you worth marrying. This could include money, livestock, household goods, land, or anything else of value. The size of your dowry directly correlated to your marriage prospects. A generous dowry might land you a husband with good land and decent prospects. A small dowry meant settling for less desirable options. No dowry at all? Well, you might want to get really good at embroidery and prepare for a long single life. Meet Sarah, a 16-year-old peasant girl whose family owns a small plot of land that barely produces enough grain to feed themselves, let alone generate surplus for trade. Her father has been trying to scrape together a dowry for her, but between bad harvests and the Lord's taxes, there's precious little left over. Sarah knows she's not ugly. She's got all her teeth, can work hard without complaining, and even knows her letters, which is more than most girls in her village. But none of that matters if her family can't pay up. Meanwhile, there's Thomas, the blacksmith's younger son, who's been watching Sarah at market for months. He thinks she's beautiful when she laughs, and he admires how gently she handles the children she helps care for. In a modern world, he might ask her out for coffee, maybe bring her flowers, see if they click. But in medieval reality, Thomas knows his romantic feelings are completely irrelevant unless the numbers work out. His father owns the smithy and has steady work, but Thomas won't inherit it. That goes to his older brother. Unless Thomas can prove he can support a wife, his feelings for Sarah might as well be written in disappearing ink. The conflict reaches its peak when both families sit down to discuss a potential marriage. It's not a romantic conversation about compatibility or shared dreams. It's a business negotiation that would make modern corporate lawyers proud. Sarah's father explains what he can offer: a small amount of silver, some household linens his wife has been weaving for years, 3 chickens, and a portion of this year's grain harvest. Thomas's father calculates whether this is enough to justify taking on another mouth to feed, especially since Thomas doesn't have his own established trade yet. The brutal mathematics of medieval marriage become crystal clear in this moment. It's not about whether Sarah and Thomas like each other, whether they share similar values, or whether they might build a happy life together. It's about whether the economic equation balances out. Can Thomas provide adequate shelter? Can Sarah's dowry help establish their household? Will their combined resources be enough to survive the next bad harvest, or the next time the Lord decides to raise taxes? Sarah sits quietly during these negotiations, watching her entire romantic future being reduced to a ledger of assets and liabilities. She realizes that her worth as a potential bride has nothing to do with her intelligence, her kindness, her capacity for love, or her dreams for the future. She's being evaluated like a piece of farm equipment, useful if the price is right, but ultimately just another transaction in the endless struggle for economic survival. Thomas faces his own moment of recognition. He understands that his feelings for Sarah, genuine as they are, don't factor into this equation at all. Love is a luxury his family can't afford to consider. If he wants to marry anyone, not just Sarah, but anyone at all, he needs to focus on building economic value, not on building emotional connections. Romance is for people who already have their basic survival needs covered. The resolution comes when both families reluctantly agree that the marriage could work, but only if Thomas can establish himself in a trade within the next year. It's not the romantic happy ending either young person was hoping for, but it's something. A possibility, a chance that economics and emotion might eventually align. Sarah and Thomas are allowed to hope, but their hope is contingent on Thomas's ability to generate enough income to support a household. As this chapter closes, we see both young people trying to navigate this impossible terrain. Sarah begins learning more practical skills that might increase her value as a wife. Cooking, preserving food, managing household accounts. Thomas throws himself into his work, trying to save every penny and learn enough about metalworking to perhaps set up his own small forge someday. They're both investing in their economic potential, because they've learned that in medieval society, love without financial security isn't just impractical, it's impossible. But there's something beautiful emerging from this harsh reality. Both Sarah and Thomas are developing a deeper understanding of what it truly means to commit to another person. They're learning that real love isn't just about feelings. It's about being willing to work, to sacrifice, to build something substantial together. Their romance may be constrained by economic necessity, but it's also being shaped by it into something more mature and realistic than the passionate but impractical love celebrated in troubadour songs. The stage is now set for exploring how some people found ways around these economic constraints, how they developed elaborate systems of courtship that allowed emotion to flourish within the rigid boundaries of financial necessity. Because even in a world where love needed a business plan, the human heart found ways to make itself heard. Let's say you're not a peasant worrying about dowries and livestock, or a merchant's daughter calculating the exchange rate of chickens to marriage prospects. Let's say you're a knight, shiny armor, impressive horse, and questionable poetry skills that would make a modern songwriter cringe. What's your love life like? Welcome to the strange, emotionally exhausting, and entirely impractical world of courtly love, where romance becomes performance art and suffering becomes sophisticated entertainment. Now, this isn't dating as we understand it. This is medieval theater of the heart, part spiritual exercise, part elaborate game, and entirely designed to keep you perpetually frustrated. Courtly love was invented by people who had apparently solved all their practical problems and needed something dramatically complicated to occupy their time. It was the romantic equivalent of deciding that regular chess was too simple, so let's play it blindfolded while reciting poetry and standing on one leg. Picture the scene. You're Sir Geoffrey, a brave knight fresh from some minor military campaign, and you've just laid eyes on Lady Guinevere of somewhere important. She's married, of course. That's absolutely essential to the whole courtly love experience. If she were available, this would just be regular romance. And where's the artistic suffering in that? No, she must be married, preferably to someone powerful and occasionally absent, because the entire point of courtly love is that it's impossible to consummate. You, the brave Sir Geoffrey, now have a choice. You can admire Lady Guinevere from a respectful distance and get on with your life like a sensible person. Or you can dive headfirst into the elaborate emotional torture chamber that is courtly love, if you choose the latter. And clearly you do, because otherwise we wouldn't have a story. You're signing up for years of exquisite voluntary misery. The first step is the declaration. Though not to the lady herself, because that would be far too straightforward. Instead, you compose terrible poetry about her silver laugh, her hair that burns like sunlight, and her eyes that are like whatever poetic comparison you can manage without actually having had a real conversation with her. These poems aren't meant to be good. They're meant to demonstrate that you're suffering so intensely for love that your creative faculties have been compromised. Lady Guinevere, meanwhile, is expected to play her part in this elaborate charade. She must be aware of your devotion. The whole court knows about it because you've been sighing dramatically and wearing her colors at tournaments. But she must maintain an air of mysterious detachment that would intimidate a glacier. She's not allowed to be too encouraging, because that would ruin the delicious agony of unrequited love. But she can't be too discouraging either, because then you might give up and find someone else to pine for, and where's the entertainment value in that? Sir Geoffrey throws himself into his role with the dedication of a method actor. He wears Lady Guinevere's favor, perhaps a ribbon or a glove, pinned prominently to his armor during tournaments. He composes increasingly melodramatic verses about his emotional state. He might challenge other knights to combat if they so much as glance at his beloved lady for longer than socially appropriate. He becomes a walking advertisement for the transformative power of hopeless passion. The brilliance and absurdity of this system become clear when you realize that the less actual contact you have with your beloved, the more pure and noble your love is considered to be. A smile across a crowded hall is precious. A brief conversation about the weather is a treasured memory to be analyzed and reanalyzed for hidden meanings. An accidental brush of fingers when she hands you a cup of wine becomes the emotional highlight of your entire year. Lady Guinevere finds herself trapped in an equally bizarre position. She's supposed to inspire this grand passion while remaining completely unavailable. She becomes a living symbol rather than a real person. She's not Guinevere the individual with her own thoughts, feelings, and desires, but Guinevere the inspiration, the unattainable ideal, the perfect woman, who exists primarily to make knights write bad poetry and joust more enthusiastically. The conflict intensifies as both participants realize they're caught in a system that prioritizes the appearance of deep emotion over any actual emotional connection. Sir Geoffrey is expected to love Lady Guinevere passionately and eternally, but he's also expected never to really get to know her as a person. She's supposed to be moved by his devotion, but she's not allowed to respond to it in any meaningful way. They're both performing roles in a romantic play that has no satisfying conclusion. The climax of this courtly love affair comes at a grand feast, where the entire elaborate pretense reaches its peak of beautiful absurdity. Sir Geoffrey has been composing a particularly overwrought ballad about Lady Guinevere's grace and virtue, comparing her favorably to various saints and celestial beings. He's prepared to perform it publicly, declaring his eternal, hopeless devotion to a woman he knows almost nothing about personally. Lady Guinevere, for her part, has prepared her own performance. She will listen to his declaration with the perfect expression of gracious distance, not so cold as to crush him entirely, but not so warm as to encourage him inappropriately. She'll offer him some small token of acknowledgement, perhaps allowing him to kiss her hand or giving him a slight nod of approval, and this minimal gesture will be enough to sustain his passionate devotion for another year or more. But as Sir Geoffrey begins his recitation, something shifts in the dynamic. Looking across the hall at Lady Guinevere, he suddenly sees not the perfect, unattainable ideal he's been worshipping, but a real woman who looks somewhat tired of being treated like a beautiful statue. And Lady Guinevere, listening to yet another poem about her ethereal qualities and divine nature, realizes she's lost herself completely in this role she's been playing. She's become so focused on being the perfect object of courtly love that she's forgotten how to be a real person with real feelings. The resolution comes with a moment of mutual recognition. Both Sir Geoffrey and Lady Guinevere understand that they've been participating in an elaborate emotional game that has very little to do with genuine affection or connection. The courtly love tradition has given them a socially acceptable way to explore feelings of romance and desire, but it's also trapped them in roles that prevent any real intimacy or understanding. Sir Geoffrey begins to see that his grand passion was largely self-created, fed more by the drama and intensity of the courtly love tradition than by any real knowledge of or compatibility with Lady Guinevere. She realizes that being worshipped as a perfect ideal is actually quite lonely. It's isolated her from authentic human connection just as much as it's isolated him. They both come to understand that courtly love serves a purpose in their society. It provides an outlet for romantic feelings in a world where most marriages are practical arrangements, and it offers a way to explore themes of devotion, loyalty, and emotional intensity within safely defined boundaries. But they also recognize its limitations. It's performance, not partnership. It's about the idea of love rather than the reality of loving another person. As the chapter concludes, both characters are left with a deeper understanding of what they're really seeking. Sir Geoffrey realizes he wants not just to worship a distant ideal, but to know and be known by someone real. Lady Guinevere understands that she wants to be valued not just for her symbolic perfection, but for her actual thoughts, feelings, and personality. They've both learned that while courtly love can be beautiful and moving, it's ultimately a substitute for the genuine connection they're really craving. The courtly love tradition continues around them. Other knights and ladies will take up these roles, playing out the same elaborate dance of desire and distance. But for Sir Geoffrey and Lady Guinevere, the experience has revealed both the appeal and the emptiness of loving someone you never really get to know. They're ready for something more authentic, more challenging, and more genuinely human. The question now becomes, in a world of arranged marriages and social constraints, how do real people find real ways to express real affection? The answer lies in the small, secret languages of the heart, in tokens, glances, and the tiny rebellions that love always finds a way to create. So you've fallen for someone. Great. Now comes the hard part. Expressing that affection in a society where touching someone's hand without a chaperone present is basically a declaration of war. Welcome to the medieval solution. Tokens. Think of it as 12th century texting. Slow, confusing, and open to wildly inaccurate interpretation. But unlike modern miscommunications that can be cleared up with a quick phone call, medieval token misunderstandings could ruin reputations, start feuds, or accidentally commit you to marrying someone's cousin. Let's say you're Sir Edmund, a knight hopelessly smitten with Lady Margaret of wherever her castle is. You can't speak to her alone without causing a scandal. Your poetry keeps getting intercepted by her confessors, who have strong opinions about appropriate metaphors. And every time you try to catch her eye during feast days, her mother materializes like a protective hawk. What do? You send her a glove. Nothing says I love you quite like mailing someone part of your wardrobe that you've been wearing for weeks. The art of token giving was incredibly complex, with rules that would make modern dating apps look refreshingly straightforward. Each item carried specific meanings, and getting the symbolism wrong could send entirely the wrong message. A glove might indicate romantic interest, but which finger of the glove was most prominent could change the meaning entirely. A ribbon could suggest devotion, but the color mattered enormously. Red for passion, white for purity, blue for loyalty, and God help you if you accidentally sent purple, which in some regions indicated you were already promised to someone else. Lady Margaret, upon receiving Sir Edmund's somewhat aromatic glove, now faces her own challenge. She's holding what amounts to a medieval love letter, except it's made of leather and smells like horse. Is he confessing love? Asking for a favor? Suggesting they run away together? Proposing marriage? Or did he simply lose his glove and she's supposed to return it? The possibilities are endless, and all of them come with potentially life-changing consequences. The genius and the madness of the token system become apparent when you realize that the more cryptic the message, the safer it was for everyone involved. If Lady Margaret is caught with a love poem, that's evidence of inappropriate correspondence. But if she's caught with a random glove, well, perhaps she found it. Perhaps she's holding it for a friend. Perhaps it's just a glove that mysteriously appeared in her possession, scented with lavender, for completely innocent reasons that have nothing to do with romantic attachment. Women participated in this elaborate communication system too, though their tokens often carried different implications. A ribbon from Lady Margaret's dress, carefully embroidered with her initials, sends a clear message when pinned to Sir Edmund's lance during a tournament. A lock of hair, traditionally kept in a small pendant or sewn into a piece of fabric, represents the ultimate gesture of trust and affection. But these gifts also carried enormous risk. Give the wrong token to the wrong person, and suddenly you're romantically linked to someone who drinks too much and has questionable personal hygiene. The token exchange becomes even more complicated when you consider the practicalities of medieval life. Sir Edmund can't exactly walk up to Lady Margaret and hand her a romantic gift in front of 40 people at dinner. He needs a delivery system that's both discreet and reliable. Enter the complex network of servants, pages, and various hangers-on who suddenly become unwitting participants in medieval romance. Young William, Sir Edmund's page, finds himself tasked with secretly delivering a carved wooden bird to Lady Margaret. This simple mission becomes an adventure worthy of a spy novel. William must figure out how to approach Lady Margaret without arousing suspicion. How to ensure she understands the gift is from Sir Edmund rather than from William himself, and how to avoid being intercepted by Lady Margaret's watchful attendants, who seem to have supernatural abilities when it comes to detecting unauthorized communications. The tension builds as William navigates the castle's complex social hierarchy, trying to find the perfect moment to make his delivery. He can't approach Lady Margaret during meals, because everyone would notice. He can't approach her during prayers, because that would be sacrilegious. He can't approach her in her chambers, because that would be scandalous. Essentially, he needs to find Lady Margaret alone in a semi-public space where a page delivering something would look normal, which in the medieval world happens approximately never. Meanwhile, Lady Margaret is trying to decode the meaning of previous tokens while managing her own reputation. She's received Sir Edmund's glove, a small carved spoon from someone who signed himself only as your devoted servant, and a suspiciously expensive-looking brooch that appeared mysteriously on her windowsill. Each item requires careful analysis. Who sent what? What does each gift mean? And most importantly, how should she respond without accidentally encouraging the wrong person or committing to something she doesn't understand? The climax comes when the token system spectacularly malfunctions. William, nervous about his secret mission and distracted by kitchen maids who keep giggling at him, delivers Sir Edmund's carved bird to the wrong Lady Margaret, specifically to Lady Margaret the Elder, who is approximately 60 years old, formidably stern, and not at all interested in romantic tokens from knights young enough to be her grandson. Lady Margaret the Elder, however, is nobody's fool. She immediately recognizes the carved bird as a romantic token, and quickly deduces that it was intended for her young niece, Lady Margaret the Younger. But rather than simply correcting the mistake, she decides to have some fun with the situation. She appears at the next feast wearing the carved bird prominently pinned to her dress, and makes pointed comments about the artistic skills of young knights and their thoughtful attention to older ladies who truly appreciate fine craftsmanship. Sir Edmund, seeing his romantic gift displayed on the wrong Lady Margaret, experiences what can only be described as medieval mortification. He realizes that his carefully planned romantic gesture has gone horribly wrong, and now the entire court is buzzing with speculation about his supposed romantic interest in a woman old enough to be his mother. He can't exactly announce that the gift was intended for someone else without embarrassing everyone involved and potentially causing a scandal. Lady Margaret the Younger, meanwhile, watches this entire drama unfold with a mixture of amusement and genuine sympathy. She can see that Sir Edmund is dying of embarrassment, and she suspects that his romantic gesture was actually intended for her. But she also can't directly intervene without acknowledging that she knows about the token system, which would suggest she's been participating in unauthorized romantic communications. The resolution comes through Lady Margaret the Elder's unexpected kindness. Having enjoyed her little joke, she arranges for the carved bird to be accidentally dropped near Lady Margaret the Younger during a castle feast. The younger woman understands immediately, picks up the token, and makes a point of examining it appreciatively where Sir Edmund can see her response. She then carefully places a flower from her hair near the place where Sir Edmund typically sits, creating her own token in return. Both young people learn valuable lessons about the complexity and fragility of medieval communication. Sir Edmund realizes that romantic gestures require not just courage and creativity, but also extremely reliable logistics. Lady Margaret the Younger understands that receiving tokens is only half the challenge. Responding appropriately without causing unintended consequences requires considerable diplomatic skill. The token system, for all its complications and potential for disaster, serves a crucial purpose in their society. It allows people to express affection and interest within a framework of plausible deniability. It creates opportunities for romantic communication while maintaining the social fiction that such communication isn't really happening. Most importantly, it gives people a way to test the waters of romantic interest without the devastating social consequences that would follow more direct approaches. As the chapter concludes, Sir Edmund and Lady Margaret the Younger have established a delicate but meaningful correspondence through carefully chosen objects. They're learning to read each other's signals, to communicate complex emotions through simple gifts, and to navigate the intricate social rules that govern their romantic expression. They're also discovering that love in their world requires not just emotional courage, but practical intelligence and considerable patience. The stage is now set for exploring an even more complex aspect of medieval romance: the elaborate system of surveillance and social control that made these secret communications both necessary and extremely dangerous. Because in a world where love required secrecy, someone was always watching, someone was always judging, and someone was always ready to report inappropriate behavior to the appropriate authorities. You finally built up the courage to talk to your crush. Maybe you're planning to offer them a flower you picked this morning, or perhaps you'll quote a little poetry you definitely didn't steal from a traveling minstrel. You're ready for a moment of romantic connection, your heart racing with anticipation. Unfortunately, you're not alone. You're never alone. Welcome to the world of medieval dating surveillance, where love is never blind because it's heavily monitored by your mother, your priest, a nosy cousin, and sometimes all three at once, plus a few neighbors who've appointed themselves as unofficial romance investigators. Let's say you're Lady Catherine, a young woman of marriageable age, which in medieval terms means you're anywhere from 14 to 20. and your family is starting to panic about your future. You cannot simply go for a walk. That's not how any of this works. You go for a walk with Margaret, your personal attendant, and Margaret's terrifyingly strict Aunt Millicent, who has already formed 17 different opinions about your posture, your pace, and the inappropriate way you smiled at that young man loading grain onto his cart 3 villages over last Tuesday. Even the most innocent activities become elaborate supervised expeditions. You want to fetch water from the well? That's a group activity now. You want to visit the market to buy ribbon for embroidery? You're traveling with an entourage that would make modern celebrities jealous, except instead of security guards protecting you from overzealous fans, you have relatives protecting you from the possibility of accidental eye contact with unmarried men. The logic behind this comprehensive surveillance system is actually quite straightforward if you accept the medieval worldview that young people are basically ticking time bombs of inappropriate desire. The goal is to protect virtue, preserve family honor, and absolutely prevent any unsanctioned touching, conversation, or emotional connection that might lead to scandal, pregnancy, or worst of all, marriage without proper financial negotiation. Young Robert, the carpenter's son, who has been trying to work up the courage to speak to Lady Catherine for months, discovers that approaching her requires strategic planning that would impress military generals. He can't simply walk up to her during market day because she's surrounded by a protective formation of older women who watch him approach with the intensity of hawks spotting a particularly suspicious mouse. He can't catch her after church services because her family whisks her away immediately after the final prayer. He can't even make eye contact during community gatherings without feeling like he's being evaluated by a tribunal of disapproving matrons. The chaperone system operates on multiple levels of surveillance that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. There's the immediate level, the designated older woman whose specific job is to monitor Lady Catherine's behavior and interactions. Then there's the family level, her parents, siblings, and various relatives who all consider themselves stakeholders in her reputation. Beyond that is the community level, neighbors, fellow churchgoers, and local gossips who view monitoring young people's romantic behavior as both a civic duty and excellent entertainment. Lady Catherine finds herself living in a fishbowl where every gesture is analyzed for improper implications. If she smiles too widely at someone, that's noted and discussed. If she doesn't smile enough, that's also problematic and might indicate unhealthy antisocial tendencies. If she walks too quickly, she might be trying to escape supervision. If she walks too slowly, she might be deliberately creating opportunities for unauthorized interactions. There's literally no way to move through the world without someone finding something to criticize or worry about. The surveillance extends beyond just preventing inappropriate romantic contact. Lady Catherine's chaperones monitor her conversations to ensure she's not saying anything that might be interpreted as flirtatious or encouraging. They observe her clothing choices to make sure she's not trying to attract undue attention. They even pay attention to where she looks during social gatherings, because sustained eye contact with the wrong person could be interpreted as a form of nonverbal communication that bypasses proper courtship protocols. Young Robert, meanwhile, discovers that the surveillance system affects him just as much as it affects Lady Catherine. When he shows up at the market where she's shopping, he's immediately noted by multiple observers who start speculating about his motives. If he appears at the same social events she attends, people begin tracking the frequency of these coincidences. If he asks casual questions about her family or her interests, those questions are reported back to her parents faster than he can finish asking them. The church adds another layer of complexity to this surveillance network. Local priests don't just monitor behavior during religious services, they consider themselves responsible for the moral welfare of young people in their community. Father Benedict has appointed himself as an unofficial advisor on proper courtship behavior, and he has strong opinions about everything from appropriate conversation topics to acceptable distances for young people to stand from each other during public gatherings. The tension builds as both Lady Catherine and Robert begin to feel like prisoners in their own lives. Every natural human impulse toward connection and affection is treated as a potential moral failing. Lady Catherine starts to resent the constant scrutiny, the way every aspect of her behavior is discussed and analyzed by people who seem to have forgotten what it's like to be young. Robert becomes increasingly frustrated with the impossibility of having any genuine interaction with the person he's interested in. The conflict reaches its peak during the annual Harvest Festival, when the normal social rules are slightly relaxed and young people are allowed more freedom to interact. Lady Catherine, desperate for just a few moments of normal human conversation, attempts to slip away from her chaperones during the dancing. She manages to find herself standing near the apple cider booth at the same time as Robert, and for a brief, magical moment, they're almost alone. But almost alone, in medieval terms, means there are only 12 people watching them instead of the usual 25. Robert manages to say hello and comment on the lovely weather. Lady Catherine responds that yes, it is indeed a pleasant evening for a festival. This exchange of perhaps 30 words total is immediately reported to Lady Catherine's mother by 3 separate observers, each of whom has a slightly different interpretation of what they witnessed and what it might mean for Lady Catherine's reputation. The resolution comes when Lady Catherine's mother sits her down for a serious conversation about the importance of maintaining proper behavior and avoiding any actions that might damage her marriageability. It's not an unkind conversation. Her mother genuinely loves her and wants to protect her from the very real social and economic consequences that could follow from a damaged reputation. But it's also a conversation that makes clear just how little freedom Lady Catherine has to make her own choices about relationships or even simple human interactions. Lady Catherine begins to understand that the surveillance system isn't just about controlling her behavior. It's about protecting her family's social and economic position. In a world where a woman's reputation directly affects her marriage prospects, and where marriage prospects determine economic security for entire families, allowing young people unsupervised romantic freedom represents an unacceptable financial risk. The chaperones aren't just being nosy or controlling, they're protecting substantial family investments. Robert also gains a deeper understanding of the social forces working against him. He realizes that his interest in Lady Catherine isn't just a personal matter between the two of them. It's a potential disruption to carefully laid family plans, economic arrangements, and social hierarchies. His desire for a simple conversation with someone he likes has implications that extend far beyond his individual romantic feelings. Both young people learn to work within the system rather than against it. Lady Catherine becomes more skilled at communicating through subtle gestures and expressions that won't alarm her chaperones. Robert learns to time his public appearances and casual comments in ways that allow for minimal but meaningful interaction without triggering the surveillance network's alarm systems. They develop a kind of romantic communication that's almost entirely nonverbal and completely public, yet somehow still manages to convey genuine affection and interest. The chapter concludes with both characters having gained a grudging respect for the complexity of their social system, even as they chafe against its restrictions. They understand that the constant surveillance serves real purposes in their society, protecting families from financial disaster and young people from social ruin. But they also recognize that this protection comes at the cost of genuine human connection and individual autonomy. As Lady Catherine sits in her chamber that evening, carefully supervised even in her own room, she begins to contemplate other ways that people in her position might find to express their feelings and communicate their romantic interests. She's heard whispered stories about love letters, secret messages passed through trusted intermediaries, and other methods of romantic communication that might allow for more substantial emotional connection while still maintaining the appearance. You're in love, or at least as in love as one can be in the medieval world, where romance requires strategic planning and emotional armor. You've exchanged meaningful glances across crowded rooms, perhaps traded a token or two without causing too much scandal. and you've mastered the art of standing exactly 3 feet away from your beloved during public gatherings. But how do you actually express the depth of your feelings when a simple "I like you" could result in excommunication, exile, or worse, an extremely awkward conversation with both sets of parents about dowries and livestock? The answer: you write a letter. Welcome to the most dangerous piece of parchment since the last papal bull declaring someone a heretic. This isn't your modern love letter, scrawled quickly on notebook paper and slipped into a locker between algebra and lunch. This is a medieval love letter, which means it's a carefully crafted document that must simultaneously declare undying passion and maintain plausible deniability. Express intimate feelings while using language so metaphorically dense that it requires a theology degree to decode, and convey romantic devotion without technically violating any of the approximately 400 social and religious rules governing appropriate correspondence between unmarried individuals. Meet Brother Marcus, a young monk whose scholarly duties have made him one of the most literate people in the region, and who has made the catastrophic mistake of falling in love with Sister Evangeline from the nearby convent. He knows this is wrong on approximately 17 different levels. He's taken vows of chastity. She's taken vows of chastity. They're both supposed to be dedicating their lives exclusively to divine love. And their respective abbots would probably lock them in separate towers if they discovered this correspondence. But the heart, as we've established, is wonderfully disobedient, even when it's wearing monastic robes. Brother Marcus sits in his cell by candlelight, staring at a blank piece of precious parchment that represents both opportunity and potential disaster. If he writes what he really feels, that Sister Evangeline's laughter during evening prayers makes him forget his Latin, that he dreams about conversations they've never had, that he questions his entire religious vocation because he can't stop thinking about her, he'll be confessing to sins that could destroy both their lives. But if he writes nothing, he'll continue living with feelings that are eating away at his supposed spiritual peace like moths attacking wool. The solution, such as it is, lies in the elaborate medieval art of romantic encryption. Brother Marcus must write a love letter that sounds like a theological treatise, express carnal longing in the language of spiritual devotion, and declare romantic passion using only metaphors that could theoretically be interpreted as religious contemplation. He begins, "My soul finds itself illuminated by a particular grace that seems to emanate from the contemplation of divine beauty as manifested in the earthly realm. Most specifically, in the form of spiritual devotion, I have observed in certain servants of the Lord, whose dedication to prayer suggests a heavenly radiance that troubles my meditations in ways I struggle to reconcile with my vows of spiritual focus." What he means is, I think you're beautiful, and I can't stop thinking about you, and it's driving me crazy. What he's written is approximately 200 words of theological gobbledygook that could be interpreted as either a love letter or a paper on mystical religious experience, depending on who's reading it and how charitable they're feeling toward young monks with suspicious literary interests. The challenge now becomes delivery, which in the medieval world requires the cooperation of people who definitely shouldn't be cooperating with this particular enterprise. Brother Marcus needs to find someone willing to carry a potentially heretical love letter from a monk to a nun. Someone trustworthy enough to keep the secret, but foolish enough to risk ecclesiastical punishment for enabling romantic correspondence between people who are supposed to be married to Jesus. Enter young Timothy, a novice monk who is still naive enough to think that love conquers all, and that surely God wouldn't mind if two people who are clearly meant for each other find a way to communicate their feelings. Timothy volunteers to deliver the letter during his next trip to the convent, to deliver some copied manuscripts. Because what could possibly go wrong with a plan that involves smuggling unauthorized romantic correspondence into a community of women who have specifically vowed to avoid exactly this kind of earthly entanglement? Meanwhile, Sister Evangeline has been experiencing her own romantic crisis. She joined the convent partly because she genuinely felt called to religious life, but mostly because her family couldn't afford a dowry, and becoming a nun was preferable to remaining unmarried and dependent on relatives who made their disapproval of her existence abundantly clear. She's been trying to embrace her religious vocation with enthusiasm, but she keeps finding herself distracted during prayers by thoughts of Brother Marcus, whose scholarly presentations during intermonastic conferences suggest an intellect and sensitivity that she finds dangerously attractive. When Timothy arrives at the convent with his smuggled letter, the delivery becomes an exercise in medieval espionage that would make modern spy novelists proud. He can't simply hand the letter to Sister Evangeline directly, because that would be witnessed by other nuns and would immediately result in questions, investigations, and probably penances that would make everyone involved wish they'd chosen different career paths. Instead, he must find a way to leave the letter where Sister Evangeline will discover it, but where it won't be found by anyone else, a challenge complicated by the fact that convents are small, crowded places where privacy is essentially non-existent, and other nuns have an uncanny ability to notice when anything is out of place. The tension builds as Timothy attempts to find the perfect hiding spot for his contraband correspondence. The library is too obvious and frequently monitored. The chapel is too sacred and would make the letter's discovery even more scandalous. The kitchen is too busy, and the letter might end up being used to wrap fish or start fires. Timothy finally settles on hiding the letter inside Sister Evangeline's prayer book, which is personal enough that other nuns won't handle it, but public enough that she'll discover it during evening prayers. Sister Evangeline finds the letter exactly as planned, but the discovery creates its own crisis. Simply possessing unauthorized correspondence from a monk could result in serious punishment, but the content of the letter presents an even more complex challenge. Brother Marcus has written what is simultaneously the most romantic and most confusing declaration of love she's ever encountered. She needs a theological dictionary to decode half his metaphors, but the underlying emotion is clear enough to make her question everything she thought she knew about her own feelings and her religious commitment. The climax comes when Sister Evangeline decides to write back, a decision that transforms her from passive recipient of romantic attention to active participant in what is now definitely a forbidden correspondence that could destroy both their religious careers. Her letter must match Brother Marcus's theological camouflage, while somehow conveying her own complex feelings about their impossible situation. She writes, "Your contemplations on divine grace have stirred within me a recognition of spiritual truths that I confess have troubled my own devotions, creating within my soul a yearning for deeper understanding of the divine love that seems to manifest itself in unexpected earthly forms, challenging my previous assumptions about the nature of religious calling and the boundaries between sacred and temporal affection." What she means is, I love you too, and I don't know what we're going to do about it. What she's written is another masterpiece of romantic encryption that could be read as either reciprocated love or advanced theological speculation, depending on the reader's interpretation and suspicion level. The exchange of letters continue for several months, creating a correspondence that is simultaneously one of the most passionate and most intellectually challenging romantic exchanges in medieval history. Both Brother Marcus and Sister Evangeline become increasingly skilled at expressing intimate feelings through elaborate religious metaphors, developing a private language that allows them to discuss their relationship while maintaining the fiction that they're engaged in scholarly theological debate. But the resolution comes with the recognition that their love letter exchange, beautiful as it is, cannot continue indefinitely without discovery. The more letters they exchange, the greater the risk that someone will notice the pattern, decode their metaphors, or simply become suspicious about why two religious people who should be focused on divine love are spending so much time writing to each other about spiritual matters that sound suspiciously like earthly romance. Both correspondents realize that they must make a choice. They can continue their letter exchange and risk everything they've built in religious life, or they can end the correspondence and try to redirect their romantic feelings toward appropriate spiritual devotion. The decision they reach reflects both the beauty and the tragedy of medieval love. They choose to write one final letter to each other, a goodbye that acknowledges the depth of their connection while accepting the impossibility of their situation. Their fin. Finally, a break. A feast day, a harvest festival, a maypole dance. In short, a rare moment when your life isn't just work, prayer, and pretending you're not interested in the blacksmith's daughter. Today, you're allowed to flirt. Sort of. As long as no one sees, or everyone sees but pretends not to, or the right people see, but not the wrong people, and definitely not in any way that could be interpreted as inappropriate by the local priest, who has opinions about everything from the length of your tunic to the enthusiasm of your laughter. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance blooms under the watchful eyes of everyone you've ever met, plus 3 chickens and a goat with questionable social judgment. Picture the village on the morning of the May Day celebration. For once, the normal rhythms of medieval life have been suspended. Instead of rising before dawn to tend livestock or begin the day's back-breaking labor, people are decorating their homes with flowers, preparing special foods that require ingredients they can't normally afford, and putting on their best clothes, which, admittedly, might still look like burlap sacks to modern eyes, but represent months of careful saving and preparation. The air buzzes with excitement and possibility, the kind of energy that makes even the most pessimistic villager think that maybe, just maybe, today something wonderful might happen. Meet Isabella, a 17-year-old weaver's daughter, who has been looking forward to this festival for months. Not because she particularly enjoys dancing around maypoles or listening to traveling minstrels whose musical abilities are questionable at best, but because festival days represent the only time when young unmarried people are allowed to interact with each other without immediate family supervision. For one magical day, she might actually have a conversation with someone her own age that lasts longer than 30 seconds and covers topics more interesting than the weather or the health of various farm animals. Isabella has been particularly hoping to see William, the carpenter's apprentice who has been finding increasingly creative excuses to walk past her father's workshop over the past few months. She's noticed him, of course. It's hard not to notice someone who suddenly develops an urgent need to examine the construction of buildings he's walked past without interest for years. But the normal social restrictions have made any meaningful interaction impossible. Today, however, with the festival's atmosphere of celebration and temporarily relaxed social rules, she might actually find out if William is as interesting as his persistent presence around her workplace suggests. William, meanwhile, has been planning his festival strategy with the dedication of a military commander preparing for battle. He's practiced casual conversation topics, rehearsed witty observations about the weather, and even learned a few simple dance steps from his younger sister, who finds his romantic anxiety hilarious, but is willing to help because she likes Isabella and thinks her brother deserves happiness, or at least deserves to stop moping around the house like a lovesick cow. The festival begins with morning prayers and blessings, because even celebration in the medieval world must acknowledge divine authority and community values. Father Gregory offers lengthy invocations, asking God to bless the harvest, protect the community, and ensure that all festivities remain appropriately modest and spiritually uplifting. His meaningful glances toward the young people in the congregation suggest he has strong opinions about appropriate festival behavior, and his prayer includes several pointed references to the importance of maintaining virtue, even during times of celebration. As the religious ceremonies conclude and the actual festivities begin, the village transforms into something resembling a medieval amusement park. Merchants arrive with exotic goods, ribbons, sweets, small mirrors, and trinkets that represent the height of luxury to people whose daily lives involve very little in the way of frivolous beauty. Musicians set up in the village square, tuning instruments that have seen better decades but still manage to produce melodies that make everyone's hearts beat a little faster. Children run around with flowers in their hair, elderly people settle into comfortable spots to watch the proceedings with indulgent smiles, and young adults begin the delicate dance of festival flirtation. The games and competitions provide the first opportunities for romantic display. Young men compete in contests of strength and skill, wrestling matches, archery competitions, races, and demonstrations of various craft abilities. These aren't just entertainment. They're opportunities to show off for potential romantic interests while maintaining the fiction that the competition is purely about community fun and friendly rivalry. William enters the woodworking contest, where participants must carve decorative objects within a time limit, partly because he's genuinely skilled at carving, but mostly because he's noticed Isabella watching the craftsmen's competitions with obvious interest. Isabella, along with other young women, participates in her own forms of festival competition. There are contests for the best decorated flower crowns, the finest embroidery work, the most beautiful singing voices, and the most graceful dancing. These competitions allow young women to display their domestic skills and personal qualities while socializing with their peers and, not incidentally, catching the attention of young men who are supposedly focused on their own activities but are actually spending considerable mental energy tracking the movements and achievements of specific female festival participants. The dancing represents the pinnacle of festival romance, the moment when all the careful preparation and nervous anticipation culminates in actual physical contact between young people of opposite genders. The maypole dance, with its intricate patterns of ribbons and coordinated movement, requires partners to hold hands, make eye contact, and move together in harmony, all under the approving gaze of the entire community, which makes the contact both thrilling and safe. For Isabella and William, being chosen as dance partners feels like winning a lottery they didn't even know they had entered. The tension builds throughout the day as Isabella and William navigate the complex social dynamics of festival interaction. They participate in group activities that allow them to work together, helping to prepare the communal feast, gathering flowers for decorations, assisting with the organization of various competitions. These shared tasks provide opportunities for conversation and cooperation that would be impossible during normal daily life. But they also require careful attention to maintaining appropriate behavior while being observed by the entire community. The climax comes during the evening dancing, when the combination of music, celebration, and temporary social freedom creates an atmosphere that allows genuine romantic connection. As Isabella and William dance together around the maypole, their hands touching as they weave in and out of the pattern of ribbons and other dancers, they experience a moment of perfect synchronization that feels both magical and completely natural. For the duration of the dance, they forget about social restrictions, family expectations, and economic considerations. They're simply two young people enjoying each other's company and discovering that they work well together, literally and figuratively. But the magic of the moment is complicated by its very publicity. Every step of their dance, every smile they exchange, every moment of obvious enjoyment in each other's company is being observed and evaluated by community members who will remember and discuss this interaction for months to come. Their romantic moment is simultaneously private and completely public, intimate and performative, spontaneous and heavily regulated by unspoken social rules about appropriate festival behavior. The resolution comes as the festival winds down and normal social restrictions begin to reassert themselves. Isabella and William have discovered that they enjoy each other's company and work well together, but they've also learned that festival romance exists within very specific boundaries. They can dance together at public celebrations, but they can't arrange private meetings. They can exchange smiles and pleasant conversation during community events, but they can't develop their relationship beyond what the community considers appropriate for unmarried young people. As the evening ends and families begin to gather their children and head home, Isabella and William find themselves facing the return to normal social reality. They've had a taste of what romantic connection might feel like, but they're also acutely aware that this connection can only exist within the narrow confines of community-approved celebrations. Their festival romance has been beautiful and meaningful, but it's also been carefully contained within boundaries that ensure it doesn't disrupt social order or economic arrangements. The chapter concludes with both young people walking home with their respective families, stealing glances back at each other across the darkening village square. They've learned that love can bloom even within restrictive social systems. But they've also discovered that such love must be patient, public, and carefully managed to avoid causing scandal or disrupting family plans. The festival has given them hope that romantic connection is possible, but it has also shown them how limited their opportunities for pursuing such connection really are. Isabella lies awake that night, replaying every moment of the day's interactions and wondering when the next festival might provide. Let's say you're not a knight with shiny armor and questionable poetry skills, not a noble with elaborate courtship rituals, and definitely not a bard with a lute and excessive feelings about everything. You're a regular villager. You wake up when the roosters crow, go to bed when the chickens settle in for the night, and spend most of your day ankle-deep in mud that you've stopped questioning the origin of. You're not looking for a poetic soulmate who will compose songs about your ethereal beauty. You're looking for someone who can milk a goat without creating unnecessary drama. And maybe, if you're lucky, someone who doesn't snore loud enough to wake the livestock. Welcome to peasant courtship, where romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry means we might be able to survive winter together without killing each other. This isn't the sweeping passion of troubadour ballads or the elaborate suffering of courtly love. This is love built on shared work, mutual respect, and the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, you can find someone who makes the endless cycle of planting, harvesting, and trying not to starve to death a little more bearable and occasionally even enjoyable. Meet Alice, a 20-year-old farmer's daughter whose dowry consists of 3 chickens, a basic understanding of herb medicine, and the ability to spin wool without getting distracted and creating tangles that take hours to fix. She's not conventionally beautiful by the standards of the ladies who appear in romantic poetry. Her hands are calloused from work, her skin is tanned from outdoor labor, and her hair spends most of its time covered by practical head wrappings rather than flowing freely in the wind like heroines in epic poems. But Alice has something more valuable than ethereal beauty. She's competent, reliable, and possessed of the kind of steady good humor that makes difficult times more manageable. Alice notices men not because they compose verses about her eyes or perform dramatic gestures of devotion, but because of how they work. She's attracted to Thomas the miller because he treats his animals kindly and never complains when the work is difficult. She admires Peter the baker's son because he shares his extra bread with families who are struggling, and because he always has time to help elderly neighbors with tasks they can no longer manage alone. She appreciates practical kindness, reliability, and the kind of quiet strength that shows up in daily work rather than in grand romantic gestures. Her courtship happens during shared tasks rather than elaborate social rituals. When the village works together to bring in the harvest, Alice finds herself working alongside Thomas, and they develop an easy partnership in the rhythm of cutting grain and loading wagons. They don't exchange passionate poetry. They exchange observations about the weather, speculation about whether this year's crop will be sufficient to get everyone through winter, and the occasional joke about neighbors whose farming techniques are questionable at best. Their conversations are practical, but they're also revealing in ways that courtly love dialogues never manage to be. Alice learns that Thomas worries about his aging parents and has been quietly setting aside part of his earnings to ensure they're comfortable in their old age. Thomas discovers that Alice has been teaching the village children their letters during winter evenings, using her own precious candles to provide light for their lessons. These aren't romantic declarations, but they're insights into character that matter more than flowery speeches about devotion and beauty. The gifts exchanged in peasant courtship are similarly practical but meaningful. Thomas brings Alice a basket he's woven during winter evenings, perfectly sized for gathering eggs and sturdy enough to last for years. Alice gives Thomas a pair of mittens she's knitted, carefully sized to fit his hands and made from wool she spun herself. These gifts represent hours of work and considerable skill, but more importantly, they represent attention to the recipient's actual needs and daily life. When Thomas carves Alice a wooden spoon with intricate patterns around the handle, he's not just demonstrating his craftsmanship. He's showing that he's paid attention to how she cooks, what tools she uses, and what would make her work easier and more pleasant. When Alice embroiders a simple design on a handkerchief for Thomas, she's creating something beautiful that he can carry with him while acknowledging the practical reality that farm work is dirty and handkerchiefs are actually useful items rather than purely decorative objects. The conflict in peasant romance comes not from social restrictions or elaborate courtship rules, but from the harsh economics of survival. Alice and Thomas genuinely care for each other and work well together, but marriage requires resources that neither family can easily spare. Thomas needs to prove he can support a wife, which means either inheriting his father's mill or establishing his own source of income. Alice's family needs to provide at least a minimal dowry, which represents a significant financial sacrifice for people who live constantly on the edge of economic disaster. The practical challenges of peasant marriage become apparent as both families calculate whether joining their resources would improve everyone's situation, or simply create more mouths to feed, without substantially increasing income. Thomas's father evaluates whether Alice would be an asset to the mill's operation. Can she keep accounts, manage customers, handle the physical demands of mill work? Alice's parents assess whether Thomas has the skills and temperament to provide steady support for their daughter. Is he reliable, hardworking, capable of adapting when circumstances change? These aren't romantic considerations, but they're not unromantic either. The fact that both families are concerned about practical compatibility suggests a kind of love that goes beyond temporary attraction to focus on building sustainable partnerships. Alice and Thomas are being evaluated not just as individuals, but as potential partners in the complex enterprise of medieval survival, which requires cooperation, mutual support, and the ability to work together through difficult times. Climax comes when the harvest is particularly good one year, and both families find themselves with enough surplus to consider the luxury of marriage based partly on personal preference rather than purely on economic necessity. Alice and Thomas have proven over months of working together that they're compatible partners, not just romantically but practically. They've demonstrated that they can cooperate effectively, support each other through difficult tasks, and maintain good humor even when circumstances are challenging. The proposal, when it comes, is characteristically practical. Thomas doesn't compose poetry or arrange elaborate romantic gestures. Instead, he approaches Alice's father to discuss the possibility of marriage, presenting a clear plan for how the combined households would work economically and what resources he can bring to the partnership. The conversation includes Alice because her opinion matters. She'll be doing much of the work that makes the marriage successful, and her skills and preferences are relevant factors in determining whether the arrangement will benefit everyone involved. Alice's response is equally practical, but genuinely romantic in its own way. She agrees to marry Thomas not because she's swept away by passion, but because she's come to know him well enough to trust him, respect him, and genuinely enjoy his company. She's seen how he treats animals, elderly people, and neighbors in distress, and she's confident that he'll treat her with the same kindness and reliability. She's also discovered that working alongside him makes difficult tasks more enjoyable, and that his presence makes her daily life more pleasant. Their wedding is a community celebration that reflects the practical nature of their courtship. There's no elaborate ceremony with dozens of attendants and expensive decorations. Instead, there's a simple exchange of vows in front of the village priest, followed by a feast that the entire community contributes to and participates in. The celebration acknowledges that this marriage isn't just joining two individuals, but creating a new household that will contribute to the community's economic and social stability. The resolution shows Alice and Thomas beginning their married life with realistic expectations and solid foundations. They're not expecting constant romance or perpetual happiness, but they're starting their partnership with mutual respect, proven compatibility, and genuine affection that has grown out of shared experience rather than romantic fantasy. They've built their relationship on understanding each other's actual personalities, work habits, and values rather than on idealized versions of romance. Their honeymoon consists of setting up their joint household, combining their belongings and resources, and establishing the rhythms of shared domestic life. It's not glamorous, but it's satisfying in ways that more elaborate romantic arrangements often fail to achieve. They're building something real and sustainable rather than pursuing an idealized version of love that has little connection to the realities of daily life. As the chapter concludes, Alice and Thomas have created a marriage that serves as a model for how love can thrive within practical constraints. They found romance not in elaborate gestures or passionate declarations, but in shared work, mutual support, and the deep satisfaction of building a life together based on realistic understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses. Their love may not inspire epic poetry, but it provides the foundation for a partnership that, you've done it! You found someone who can cook without burning down the house, clean without complaining about every speck of dirt, tolerate your extended family's questionable opinions about everything, and doesn't visibly recoil when they see your feet. True love, right? Wrong. Now comes the really complicated part. Getting married, which in medieval terms means you're about to enter into a legally binding contract that's been negotiated with all the romantic passion of a livestock auction and all the permanence of a papal decree. If you think modern wedding planning is stressful, with its concerns about guest lists, flower arrangements, and whether the DJ will play music that doesn't embarrass your relatives, you've clearly never tried to navigate a medieval marriage, where the ceremony is the least important part of a process that involves property law, inheritance rights, ecclesiastical authority, family politics, and economic calculations complex enough to make modern accountants weep with frustration. Let's start with the legal framework, because in the medieval world, you can't simply decide to get married and then figure out the details later. Marriage is a sacrament, one of the 7 most important religious ceremonies in the Catholic Church, which means it's not just a personal decision between two people who happen to like each other. It's a religious act that requires divine blessing, clerical oversight, and community witness, plus documentation that proves the marriage is legitimate according to both church law and secular legal requirements. Meet Henry and Margaret, 2 young people who have successfully navigated the complex world of medieval courtship and have received permission from their families to marry. You might think the hard part is over, but you'd be spectacularly wrong. Now begins the process of negotiating a marriage contract that will determine not just their personal relationship, but the economic and legal structure of their joint household, the inheritance rights of their future children, and the financial obligations of both extended families for potentially decades to come. The first challenge involves determining what each party brings to the marriage. Margaret's family must specify her dowry, the money, property, goods, and other assets that will transfer to Henry's household upon marriage. This isn't a simple matter of writing down some numbers and calling it done. The dowry must be evaluated, documented, and guaranteed by Margaret's family, because if they promise more than they can deliver, the marriage contract becomes invalid, and everyone involved faces potential legal consequences. Margaret's dowry includes 40 silver coins, saved over years of careful budgeting, a cow that's currently pregnant and therefore represents future economic value, household linens that her mother and sister have been weaving and embroidering for the past 3 years, a set of cooking pots that represent a significant investment in metal goods, and a small plot of land that will provide ongoing income if properly managed. Each item must be assessed for current value and future potential, creating a complex financial calculation that requires expertise in livestock breeding, textile production, land management, and market economics. Henry's family, meanwhile, must demonstrate that he can support a wife and future children. This requires documenting his income, his professional skills, his access to land or other productive resources, and his prospects for economic advancement. Henry works as a carpenter, which provides steady income, but requires substantial investment in tools and materials. His family must prove that his workshop is financially stable, that he has sufficient tools to maintain his trade, and that he has established relationships with customers who will provide ongoing work. The negotiation process involves both families, the local priest who will perform the ceremony, and often a scribe who can document the agreement in writing. These negotiations can take weeks or months, because every detail of the marriage contract has long-term consequences that affect not just Henry and Margaret, but their parents, siblings, future children, and various other relatives who have financial or social interests in the marriage's success. Father Benedict, the parish priest, plays a crucial role in these negotiations, not just as the religious authority who will bless the marriage, but as a legal expert who understands church law regarding marriage contracts. He must verify that Henry and Margaret are free to marry, that neither is already married, that they're not too closely related, that both have reached the minimum age for marriage, and that both are entering the marriage voluntarily rather than under coercion from their families. The complexity increases when the families discover potential complications. Margaret's family reveals that part of her dowry land is subject to a dispute with neighbors over property boundaries, which means the land's value is uncertain until the dispute is resolved. Henry's family admits that his carpenter tools are partly owned by his master, who has first rights to purchase them if Henry wants to establish his own independent workshop. These complications require additional negotiations and legal documentation to ensure that the marriage contract accurately reflects what each party is actually contributing. The conflict intensifies when both families realize that their initial assumptions about the marriage's economic benefits were overly optimistic. Margaret's family had hoped that Henry's carpentry skills would provide steady income that would help support Margaret's aging parents. Henry's family had expected that Margaret's dowry would provide enough capital to expand Henry's workshop and increase his earning potential. But the detailed negotiations reveal that both families' expectations exceed what the other can realistically provide. This leads to a crisis where the marriage almost falls apart, not because Henry and Margaret don't care for each other, but because their families can't agree on terms that satisfy everyone's economic needs and expectations. Margaret finds herself caught between her genuine affection for Henry and her family's financial concerns. Henry faces pressure from his parents to consider other potential wives whose families might offer more advantageous terms. The climax comes when Father Benedict intervenes, not as a romantic advocate for true love, but as a practical mediator who understands that successful marriages require realistic economic foundations. He helps both families restructure their expectations and negotiate terms that are less ambitious but more achievable. Margaret's family agrees to provide a smaller dowry that they can definitely deliver, and Henry's family accepts that his wife's economic contribution will be modest but reliable. The final marriage contract, when it's completed, resembles a modern business partnership agreement more than a romantic commitment. It specifies exactly what property and assets each party contributes, how household finances will be managed, what happens to shared property if either spouse dies, how debts and obligations will be handled, and what support each extended family will provide during times of economic difficulty. But within this elaborate legal framework, there's also genuine care and commitment. Henry and Margaret have chosen each other not just for economic reasons, but because they've developed real affection and respect through their courtship process. The marriage contract protects their practical interests, but it also creates a foundation for building the kind of partnership that can weather the inevitable challenges of medieval life. The wedding ceremony itself is relatively simple compared to the months of legal preparation that preceded it. Henry and Margaret exchange vows in front of the church, witnessed by their families and community members who have a stake in the marriage's success. Father Benedict blesses their union and reminds everyone present that marriage is both a holy sacrament and a social contract that creates obligations and responsibilities for the entire community. The resolution shows Henry and Margaret beginning their married life with a clear understanding of their mutual obligations and realistic expectations about their economic situation. They're not starting their marriage with romantic fantasies about perpetual happiness, but they're also not entering a purely practical arrangement devoid of genuine affection. They've created a legal and economic partnership that provides security and stability, while also allowing space for love to grow and develop over time. Their wedding feast reflects the practical nature of their marriage contract. The celebration is funded jointly by both families according to terms specified in the marriage negotiations. And the guest list includes people who have economic or social relationships with the new household, rather than just personal friends of the bride and groom. The feast serves multiple purposes: celebrating the marriage, demonstrating both families' financial stability, and creating community witnesses to the new social and economic arrangement. As the chapter concludes, Henry and Margaret have successfully transformed their personal affection into a legal and economic institution that serves the interests of their families and community, while also providing a framework for their own happiness. They've learned that medieval marriage requires not just emotional compatibility, but practical skills in negotiation, financial planning, and legal documentation. Their love story has become a business plan, but it's a business plan that allows genuine partnership and mutual support to flourish within carefully defined boundaries. The stage is now set for exploring what happens when people reject this entire system of arranged marriages and practical negotiations, choosing instead to follow their hearts regardless of family wishes, economic considerations, or social expectations. Because even in a world where marriage is primarily a legal and economic institution, some people still insist on prioritizing love over everything else. And their stories of romantic rebellion reveal both the beauty and the danger of choosing passion over prudence. Let's say you've had enough. Enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a particularly valuable piece of farm equipment whose primary function is to combine two agricultural estates in a mutually beneficial arrangement. You're a noble, born into wealth and privilege, but for once in your life, you want to marry for love. Not for land, not for lineage, not for your father's strategic political ambitions, just love. Congratulations. You're about to cause the kind of scandal that will be discussed in hushed whispers for generations and possibly result in at least 3 different feuds, 2 excommunications, and a small war. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of setting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes while singing folk songs about personal freedom. When you ran off to marry someone of your own choosing, it wasn't just personal rebellion. It was political sabotage, economic terrorism, and social disruption, all rolled into one romantic gesture that would make modern reality TV producers weep with envy at the sheer drama potential. Meet Lady Eleanor of Ravenshollow, a 19-year-old noblewoman who has been promised in marriage to Lord Bardolph Vaughan Estate Security, a man whose primary qualifications as a husband include owning substantial lands that border her father's territory. Having survived 3 previous wives without being officially accused of murdering any of them, and possessing enough political connections to make the alliance advantageous for both families' long-term strategic interests. Lord Bardolph is 42 years old, has breath that could wilt flowers at 20 paces, and treats conversations with women as unnecessary obstacles to the more important business of discussing land management and military tactics. Lady Eleanor, however, has committed the ultimate medieval transgression. She's fallen genuinely, passionately, inconveniently in love with Sir Roderick, a landless younger son who serves as a knight in her father's household. Sir Roderick has no inheritance, no political connections, and no prospects beyond his skill with a sword and his ability to compose poetry that actually rhymes properly instead of forcing random words together because they sound vaguely similar. He's everything a sensible noblewoman should avoid: handsome, charming, romantic, and completely useless for advancing her family's political and economic interests. Their courtship has been conducted entirely in secret, through a combination of meaningful glances across crowded halls, carefully orchestrated accidental encounters in castle corridors, and love letters smuggled by sympathetic servants who are probably going to regret their romantic idealism when this entire situation explodes into the kind of scandal that destroys careers and sometimes lives. Lady Eleanor and Sir Roderick have managed to fall deeply in love while navigating the complex social restrictions of noble household life. But they've also created a situation that has no acceptable resolution within the existing social system. The conflict reaches its breaking point when Lady Eleanor's father announces that her marriage to Lord Bardolph will take place in 6 weeks, with a wedding ceremony designed to demonstrate both families' wealth and political power. The guest list includes bishops, other noble families, representatives from neighboring kingdoms, and enough important people to ensure that the marriage alliance receives maximum publicity and social recognition. Calling off the wedding at this point would be more than embarrassing. It would be a public humiliation that could damage both families' reputations and political standing for years. Lady Eleanor faces an impossible choice. She can honor her family's arrangements and marry a man she finds repulsive, or she can follow her heart and destroy her family's political plans, her own social standing, and possibly Sir Roderick's life. Since her father is likely to respond to romantic betrayal with violence rather than understanding, medieval noble families didn't tend to react to emotional rebellion with therapy and family counseling sessions. Attention builds as Lady Eleanor and Sir Roderick realize that they have only a few weeks to decide between accepting the inevitable or attempting an elopement that will require them to abandon everything they've ever known: family, social position, financial security, and legal protection. They'll be choosing love over literally everything else in their lives. And there's no guarantee that love alone will be sufficient to sustain them through the practical challenges of life as social outcasts. Sir Roderick understands that helping Lady Eleanor escape her arranged marriage is likely to be interpreted as kidnapping, theft, and treason, charges that could result in execution if her family decides to pursue justice through legal channels, rather than simply hiring assassins to solve the problem more efficiently. He's risking not just his own life, but the lives of anyone who helps them, because noble families have long memories and substantial resources for pursuing vengeance against people who interfere with their political arrangements. The planning for their elopement becomes an exercise in medieval espionage that requires careful attention to timing, logistics, and misdirection. They need to escape from a heavily guarded castle without being detected, travel to a location where they can find a priest willing to perform a marriage ceremony without proper authorization from their families, and establish some kind of new life in a place where Lady Eleanor's father's political influence won't reach them immediately. Brother Francis, a young monk at a nearby monastery, becomes their unwitting accomplice when Sir Roderick approaches him with a request for spiritual guidance about matters of conscience and moral obligation. Sir Roderick presents their situation as a theological question about whether divine love should take precedence over earthly family obligations, and Brother Francis, who is genuinely committed to ideals of Christian love and moral purity, agrees to perform a marriage ceremony if the couple can reach his monastery. The climax comes on the night before Lady Eleanor's scheduled departure for Lord Bardolph's estate, where final wedding preparations are supposed to take place. Lady Eleanor and Sir Roderick implement their escape plan, which involves her feigning illness to avoid the farewell dinner, Sir Roderick creating a distraction in the castle courtyard, and both of them slipping away during the night shift change when guards are least attentive and most focused on their own comfort rather than preventing romantic escapes. Their midnight ride to the monastery becomes a race against time and discovery. They're traveling on horseback through unfamiliar territory in darkness, while trying to avoid main roads where they might encounter other travelers who could recognize Lady Eleanor and report her location to her family. They're also dealing with the practical challenges of medieval travel, poor roads, unpredictable weather, and the constant possibility of encountering bandits who would be delighted to rob a noble lady and her knight escort. The marriage ceremony itself takes place in the monastery chapel at dawn, with only Brother Francis and two confused chickens as witnesses. It's not the elaborate wedding that Lady Eleanor was raised to expect, with hundreds of guests, expensive decorations, and a feast that demonstrates her family's wealth and social importance. Instead, it's a simple exchange of vows in a cold stone building, with no flowers, no music, and no celebration beyond the quiet satisfaction of two people who have chosen each other against overwhelming social pressure. But the resolution brings immediate consequences rather than romantic happiness. By the time Lady Eleanor and Sir Roderick have completed their marriage ceremony and are attempting to figure out what to do next, messengers from Ravenshallow are already spreading news of the scandal throughout the region. Lady Eleanor's father has discovered her disappearance, correctly deduced what happened, and begun mobilizing both legal and military resources to address what he considers an act of theft and betrayal. The newlyweds find themselves in the impossible position of being legally married, but practically homeless, socially ostracized, and economically destitute. Lady Eleanor has forfeited her inheritance, her social position, and her family's protection. Sir Roderick has gained a wife, but lost his employment, his patron, and any hope of building a career in military service. They've chosen love, but they've also chosen poverty, danger, and social isolation. Some elopements end in tragedy, with a runaway couple being captured, punished, and forcibly separated. Others end in gradual reconciliation, as families eventually decide that the scandal of ongoing family feuds is worse than the scandal of accepting an inappropriate marriage. A few end in successful escape and the establishment of new lives in distant places where family politics can't reach and where romantic love can actually provide the foundation for a sustainable partnership. Lady Eleanor and Sir Roderick's story becomes one of the successful escapes, but only after months of hiding, traveling, and slowly building a new life far from the political conflicts they've created. They eventually establish themselves in a small town where Sir Roderick can work as a traveling merchant, and Lady Eleanor can use her education and social skills to build relationships with local families who don't know or care about her noble background. The chapter concludes with both characters having learned that choosing love over social obligation requires not just romantic courage, but practical skills in survival, adaptation, and building new identities from scratch. Their elopement has given them the freedom to create their own lives, but it has also forced them to abandon the security and social support systems they grew up with. They've discovered that love can indeed conquer many obstacles, but it requires considerable practical intelligence and personal resilience to conquer the specific obstacles created by medieval social and economic systems. Their story becomes a cautionary tale told in whispers throughout the noble families of the region, a reminder that romantic rebellion is possible, but dangerous, that love can triumph over social pressure, but often at enormous personal cost. It also becomes a source of hope for other young people trapped in unwanted marriages. Proof that escape is possible for those willing to sacrifice everything else for the chance to choose their own partners and create their own definitions of happiness. Ah, marriage. That beautiful union of two souls and their respective financial portfolios. Because in the Middle Ages, love was lovely. But a dowry, now that was truly romantic. Nothing said, "I want to spend my life with you," quite like a detailed inventory of livestock, household goods, and precious metals that would transfer ownership upon the signing of marriage contracts. Welcome to medieval marriage economics, where romance came with a price tag and wedding vows included clauses about property management that would make modern prenuptial agreements look like love letters. Let's say you're a bride-to-be in medieval Europe. Congratulations. You're not just getting married, you're being launched like a small, dowry-equipped economic vessel into the turbulent waters of household finance. Your family has spent years preparing for this moment, not by teaching you about love and partnership, but by accumulating the collection of money, goods, and assets that will make you attractive to potential husbands and their families, who will evaluate your romantic potential primarily through the lens of financial spreadsheets and investment portfolios. Meet Matilda, an 18-year-old merchant's daughter, whose upcoming marriage represents the culmination of 15 years of careful financial planning by her parents. Her dowry has been assembled piece by piece, starting when she was just 3 years old, and her mother began setting aside a few coins each month in a special chest that would eventually fund Matilda's transition from daughter to wife. By now, that chest contains 40 silver marks, a substantial sum that represents years of careful budgeting and financial sacrifice by her entire family. But the dowry isn't just about money. Matilda's trousseau includes 6 woolen dresses that her mother and sisters have been sewing and embroidering for the past 4 years. Household linens that represent hundreds of hours of spinning and weaving, a complete set of pewter dishes that cost more than most families earn in a year, 2 feather beds with elaborate carved headboards, and an impressive collection of kitchen equipment that will allow her to establish a functional household immediately upon marriage. The most valuable part of Matilda's dowry, however, is the dairy cow that her father purchased specifically for this purpose 3 years ago. This isn't just any cow. It's a carefully selected animal with proven breeding history, guaranteed to produce milk consistently and to bear healthy calves that will provide ongoing economic value to Matilda's future household. The cow alone is worth more than many peasant families' entire annual income, and its inclusion in the dowry demonstrates both the merchant family's wealth and their serious commitment to ensuring Matilda's marriage gets off to a financially sound start. Her prospective husband, Geoffrey the goldsmith, and his family evaluate Matilda's dowry with the intensity of modern investment bankers analyzing a potential merger. They calculate not just the immediate value of her contributions, but the long-term economic potential of integrating her assets into their household economy. The silver coins will provide working capital for expanding Geoffrey's goldsmith business. The household goods will reduce the immediate expenses of setting up a new household. The cow will provide both daily milk and future income from breeding. But Geoffrey's family also brings their own economic calculation to the marriage negotiation. As the groom, Geoffrey is expected to provide the mortgage, a gift to Matilda that will become her personal property and provide economic security if she becomes widowed. Geoffrey's mortgage includes a small house in the town's commercial district that will serve as both their residence and his workshop, plus a collection of goldsmith tools and raw materials that represent his professional capital. The economic negotiations become complicated when both families realize that medieval marriage isn't just about combining existing assets, but about creating financial obligations that will extend far into the future. Matilda's parents must guarantee that her dowry will be delivered as promised. If the cow dies or the silver coins turn out to be debased metal, Jeffrey's family can demand compensation or even annul the marriage contract. Jeffrey's family must ensure that he can provide ongoing support for Matilda and their future children, which requires demonstrating that his goldsmith business is stable and profitable. The conflict intensifies when the marriage negotiations reveal that medieval economics operate on assumptions that seem bizarre to modern sensibilities. Matilda's dowry, once delivered to Jeffrey's household, will be managed entirely by her husband. She'll lose direct control over assets that her family spent years accumulating specifically for her benefit. In return, Jeffrey becomes legally responsible for Matilda's financial support for the rest of her life, including the obligation to provide for her if he dies before she does, which requires setting aside resources that won't benefit his own family directly. The complexity of medieval marriage economics becomes apparent when Father Marcus, the priest overseeing the marriage contract, explains the various scenarios that must be addressed in the legal documentation. What happens if Matilda dies in childbirth before bearing any children? Her dowry reverts to her family, but Jeffrey keeps the household goods that have already been integrated into daily use. What happens if Jeffrey dies young? Matilda receives the mortgage as her widow's portion, but Jeffrey's family retains control of the goldsmith business and tools. What happens if the marriage produces no male heirs? The property inheritance becomes a complex negotiation between multiple family claims. The bride price system, practiced in some regions and among some social classes, creates an entirely different economic dynamic. Instead of Matilda's family paying Jeffrey's family to accept her as a wife, Jeffrey's family would pay Matilda's family for the privilege of gaining her as a household member. This system recognizes that young women represent economic value through their labor, reproductive capacity, and potential for creating beneficial family alliances. Jeffrey would essentially be purchasing Matilda from her family, compensating them for the loss of her work and future earning potential. The negotiation reaches its climax when both families discover that their assumptions about medieval marriage economics were overly optimistic. Matilda's family had hoped that her substantial dowry would secure her a position in a wealthy household where she'd enjoy high social status and economic security. Jeffrey's family had expected that Matilda's dowry would provide enough capital to significantly expand their goldsmith business and increase the family's wealth and social position. But the detailed negotiations reveal that the economic benefits of marriage are more modest and come with more obligations than either family had initially calculated. The resolution comes when both families adjust their expectations and negotiate terms that are more realistic but still beneficial for everyone involved. Matilda's dowry will be delivered in stages over the first 2 years of marriage, allowing both families to verify that the partnership is working successfully before transferring the most valuable assets. Jeffrey's mortgage will include not just property, but also an apprenticeship arrangement for any younger sons from the marriage, ensuring that future generations will have professional opportunities. The final marriage contract, when completed, reads like a comprehensive business plan that happens to include emotional partnership as one of many practical considerations. It specifies exactly what assets each party contributes, how those assets will be managed during the marriage, what happens to shared property if either spouse dies, how household debts and business obligations will be handled, and what level of support each extended family will provide during economic emergencies. But within this elaborate financial framework, there's also genuine care and practical wisdom. Both families recognize that successful marriages require not just compatible economics, but also compatible personalities, shared values, and mutual respect. The economic negotiations have revealed that Matilda and Jeffrey work well together in planning and decision-making, that they have similar approaches to money management and household organization, and that they're both committed to building something substantial and lasting together. The wedding ceremony itself becomes an economic performance as well as a religious and social celebration. The feast demonstrates both families' financial capacity and their commitment to the new household's success. The gifts presented to the new couple serve as both wedding presents and economic investments in their future prosperity. The guest list includes people who have business relationships with both families, creating opportunities for expanding commercial networks and establishing new economic partnerships. As the chapter concludes, Matilda and Jeffrey begin their married life with a clear understanding of their economic partnership and realistic expectations about their financial situation. They're starting their marriage with substantial assets and careful financial planning, but they're also beginning with obligations and responsibilities that will require ongoing attention and management. Their love story has become a business plan, but it's a business plan that provides security and stability while allowing genuine affection and partnership to develop within carefully structured boundaries. The economic complexity of their marriage reflects the broader reality of medieval life, where personal relationships are always embedded within larger systems of family economics, social obligation, and community expectations. Their dowry and bride price arrangements aren't obstacles to love, but frameworks that allow love to flourish within sustainable, practical arrangements. They've learned that medieval romance requires not just emotional compatibility, but also financial literacy, legal knowledge, and family diplomacy skills that will serve them well throughout their married life. The stage is now set for exploring what happens when people choose alternatives to marriage entirely, examining the world of religious life, where men and women supposedly renounce earthly love for divine devotion, but where human nature still finds ways to complicate even the most spiritually focused environments with the eternal problems of attraction, longing, and forbidden desire. So you didn't go the marriage route. Maybe you were the second son with no inheritance prospects, or your dowry was suspiciously small and consisted mainly of 3 chickens and a prayer book. Or you genuinely felt called to serve God in a life of poverty, chastity, and what you hoped would be blissful spiritual contemplation. Either way, you've joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations, you've just taken vows of poverty, chastity, and an aggressive disinterest in romance that should theoretically solve all your earthly relationship problems forever. And yet, here you are in your stone cloister, surrounded by silence, candlelight, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful eyes, wondering why your prayers are starting to sound suspiciously like love poetry, and why spiritual contemplation has become considerably more complicated than anyone mentioned during your novice training. Yes, even behind monastery walls, where the entire point is to dedicate your life exclusively to divine love, forbidden earthly love found a way to bloom like wildflowers in carefully tended gardens of spiritual discipline. To be clear, falling in love in a religious community was deeply discouraged, the kind of discouraged that could result in public penance, exile to remote monasteries where the primary entertainment was copying manuscripts about proper moral behavior, or being assigned to spend your days contemplating your sins while scrubbing floors that were already clean enough to perform surgery on. Meet Sister Beatrice, a 22-year-old nun who joined the convent of St. Margaret not because she felt an irresistible calling to religious life, but because her family couldn't afford a dowry large enough to secure a respectable marriage, and because convent life offered education, security, and the chance to do meaningful work in a world that offered few alternatives for unmarried women. She's been genuinely committed to her religious vows for 3 years, finding satisfaction in the convent's scholarly work, the rhythm of communal prayer, and the sense of purpose that comes from dedicating her life to something larger than personal concerns. But Sister Beatrice has recently discovered that spiritual devotion becomes significantly more challenging when Brother Thomas from the nearby monastery starts appearing at inter-community religious conferences with increasing frequency, bringing theological questions that seem designed more to facilitate conversation with her than to resolve actual doctrinal uncertainties. Brother Thomas is supposed to be discussing manuscript illumination techniques and scriptural interpretation, but he keeps finding excuses to seek Sister Beatrice's opinions on matters that could probably be resolved without extensive consultation. Their initial interactions are entirely appropriate and carefully supervised, taking place during official religious gatherings where conversations are monitored by senior clergy who have extensive experience in detecting inappropriate emotional undercurrents in supposedly scholarly discussions. But despite the careful oversight, Sister Beatrice and Brother Thomas begin developing the kind of intellectual and emotional connection that makes both of them question their understanding of divine love versus earthly attachment. The problem with monastic communities is that they're filled with intelligent, sensitive people who've chosen lives of contemplation and spiritual depth, which means they're exactly the kind of people who might develop profound emotional connections if given the opportunity to engage in meaningful conversation about subjects they're passionate about. Sister Beatrice and Brother Thomas discover that they share not just religious devotion, but intellectual curiosity, literary interests, and approaches to spiritual practice that complement each other in ways that feel both inspiring and dangerous. Their forbidden attraction manifests initially through theological discussions that become increasingly personal and emotionally charged. Brother Thomas writes scholarly treatises on divine love that include metaphors suspiciously reminiscent of earthly romantic poetry. Sister Beatrice responds with her own theological writings about spiritual longing that could be interpreted as either mystical religious experience or barely disguised romantic yearning, depending on the reader's level of theological sophistication and romantic skepticism. The conflict intensifies when both religious communities become involved in a joint project to create an illuminated manuscript celebrating the lives of local saints. This legitimate scholarly collaboration requires Sister Beatrice and Brother Thomas to work together regularly, consulting on artistic decisions, coordinating research, and reviewing each other's contributions to ensure theological accuracy and artistic consistency. The project provides perfectly reasonable justification for ongoing interaction, but it also creates opportunities for personal conversation that wouldn't normally be available to people who vowed to avoid exactly this kind of emotional complication. As their collaboration progresses, Sister Beatrice and Brother Thomas begin exchanging letters that are technically about manuscript research, but increasingly reveal personal thoughts, spiritual struggles, and intellectual interests that have nothing to do with saint biography or artistic technique. Their correspondence develops into a sophisticated intellectual relationship that satisfies emotional needs neither of them realized they had, but it also creates the kind of personal intimacy that's specifically forbidden by their religious vows. The social pressure to maintain their marriage becomes enormous as their unhappiness becomes apparent to family and community members who have substantial emotional and economic investments in the relationship's success. Walter's parents sacrificed significantly to help establish the bakery that makes their son's marriage economically viable. Agnes's family provided a dowry that represented years of careful saving and that can't be easily recovered if the marriage fails. Both extended families have social reputations tied to the success of this union. Father Benedict, their parish priest, becomes involved when community members express concern about the obvious tension between Walter and Agnes. His approach to marital counseling reflects medieval understanding of marriage as primarily a social and economic institution rather than a romantic partnership. He focuses on helping both spouses understand their respective obligations and responsibilities, rather than addressing their emotional compatibility or personal happiness. The climax comes when Agnes, desperate for emotional connection and practical support during her pregnancy, begins developing a friendship with Robert, a traveling merchant who visits their village regularly and who treats her with the kind of consideration and interest that her husband never demonstrates. Their relationship remains entirely proper and public, but it provides Agnes with the intellectual stimulation and emotional validation that her marriage lacks. Walter's discovery of Agnes's friendship with Robert triggers a crisis that forces both spouses to confront the reality of their marital situation. Walter feels betrayed and humiliated, not because Agnes has done anything technically inappropriate, but because her obvious enjoyment of another man's company highlights everything that's missing from their own relationship. Agnes realizes that her friendship with Robert has shown her what emotional partnership might feel like, making her even more aware of what she's lacking in her marriage. The resolution comes not through romantic reconciliation or dramatic change, but through a gradual process of acceptance and adaptation that reflects the reality of medieval life. Walter and Agnes learn to coexist by lowering their expectations and finding ways to minimize conflict rather than maximize happiness. They develop parallel lives within the same household, each focusing on activities and relationships that provide satisfaction without requiring significant cooperation from their spouse. Agnes finds fulfillment in her role as a mother and in her friendships with other women in the village, who understand the challenges of managing difficult marriages while maintaining social respectability. She learns to appreciate Walter's reliability and economic stability, even though she never develops genuine affection for him as a person. Walter focuses on his work and business relationships, treating his marriage as a domestic arrangement that serves practical purposes rather than emotional needs. Their marriage settles into a pattern of polite coexistence that satisfies social expectations while allowing both partners to find meaning and satisfaction in other aspects of their lives. They're not happy in any romantic sense, but they're not miserable either. They've learned to work around their incompatibilities rather than trying to overcome them, creating a functional household that serves the needs of their children and community, even though it doesn't provide personal fulfillment for either spouse. The chapter concludes with Walter and Agnes having developed a realistic understanding of what their marriage can and cannot provide. They've learned that medieval marriage serves multiple purposes: economic security, social stability, child rearing, community integration, and that romantic happiness is only one possible benefit among many practical considerations. Their relationship has become a working partnership rather than a love story, but it's a partnership that allows both people to build meaningful lives within the constraints of their social and economic circumstances. Their experience reflects the broader reality of medieval marriage, where personal compatibility was often discovered after the wedding rather than before, and where couples were expected to adapt to each other rather than seeking partners who matched their personalities and preferences. Their story illustrates both the limitations and the resilience of human relationships within systems that prioritize social stability over individual happiness, showing how people can create functional lives even within relationships that don't provide romantic fulfillment. The stage is now set for exploring what happens when death intervenes in marriage, examining how medieval society handled widowhood and the opportunities for second chances at love that became available when people were freed from unsuccessful first marriages through circumstances beyond anyone's control. Your spouse is dead. Maybe it was the plague that swept through the village last winter, claiming a third of the population before moving on to terrorize neighboring communities. Maybe it was a farming accident involving a spooked horse and an unfortunate encounter with a plow. Maybe they simply developed a fever that started as a minor inconvenience and escalated into something that medieval medicine couldn't address with prayer, bloodletting, and hopeful herb combinations. However it happened, you're now widowed, and suddenly the medieval dating market has reopened with entirely different rules, opportunities, and challenges than anything you experienced during your first venture into marriage. Being a widow or widower in the Middle Ages was oddly liberating, at least compared to the complete lack of autonomy that characterized most other social positions available to medieval people. For the first time in your adult life, you might actually have some control over your romantic destiny, assuming you can navigate the complex web of family expectations, economic pressures, and social conventions that still govern remarriage, even when you're theoretically free to make your own choices. Meet Isabel, a 32-year-old widow whose husband Gerard died 6 months ago after a brief illness that progressed from minor stomach complaints to fatal complications in less than 2 weeks. Their marriage had been arranged by their families and was neither particularly happy nor notably unhappy. They developed a functional partnership that served practical purposes without providing much emotional satisfaction for either spouse. Gerard was a competent farmer and reliable provider, but he was also a man of few words and even fewer romantic impulses. Treating their marriage as a business arrangement that required careful management rather than a personal relationship that might provide companionship or affection. Isabelle finds herself in the unusual position of mourning Gerard's death, while simultaneously experiencing a sense of freedom that she feels guilty about acknowledging. She genuinely misses aspects of married life: the financial security, the social respectability, the shared responsibility for household management, and even Gerard's steady, if unimaginative, presence. But she's also discovering that widowhood offers opportunities for independence and self-direction that she never expected to experience in medieval society, where women typically moved from their father's authority to their husband's control without ever managing their own affairs. As Gerard's widow, Isabelle inherits his property and assets, making her one of the few women in her community who owns land, livestock, and other valuable resources in her own right. This economic independence transforms her social position dramatically. Instead of being viewed as a dependent who requires male protection and guidance, she's now seen as a potentially valuable partner who brings substantial assets to any future marriage. The irony isn't lost on her that Gerard's death has made her more attractive to potential suitors than she ever was as a young unmarried woman with a modest dowry. The suitors begin appearing with remarkable speed, suggesting that the medieval community has been monitoring the economic status of local widows with the efficiency of modern investment advisors, tracking market opportunities. Within 2 months of Gerard's death, Isabelle has received formal inquiries from 3 different men whose families are interested in discussing possible marriage arrangements. The attention is flattering, but also overwhelming, particularly since she's still adjusting to managing Gerard's farm operations and learning to make decisions without consulting anyone else. The first suitor is Martin, a widower with 4 young children who needs a wife primarily to manage his household and care for his offspring. His proposal is refreshingly honest about his motivations. He requires domestic assistance and child care services, and he can offer economic stability and social respectability in return. There's no pretense of romantic attraction, but there's also no deception about expectations. Martin makes it clear that he's seeking a practical partnership rather than a passionate romance, which might actually be preferable to arrangements based on unrealistic emotional expectations. The second suitor is Thomas, a never-married man in his 40s whose family has been pressuring him to find a wife for years. Thomas has been reluctant to marry because he's particular about household management and worried about finding a woman who meets his standards for domestic competence. Isabelle's proven ability to run a successful household and manage farm operations makes her appealing to Thomas, but his fastidious personality and rigid expectations remind her uncomfortably of the less pleasant aspects of marriage to Gerard. The third suitor is Richard, a younger man whose family farms land adjacent to Gerard's property. A marriage between Isabelle and Richard would combine 2 productive farms into a single larger operation that could be more efficient and profitable than either property managed separately. Richard is pleasant, hardworking, and genuinely interested in Isabelle as a person, rather than just as an economic opportunity. But the significant age difference between them creates social complications that make some community members question whether such a marriage would be appropriate. The conflict Isabelle faces isn't just about choosing between potential husbands, but about deciding whether she wants to remarry at all. Widowhood has given her a taste of independence that she finds surprisingly appealing. She enjoys making her own decisions about farm management, household organization, and daily routines without needing to accommodate another person's preferences and habits. She's discovered that she's capable of managing complex economic and practical challenges that she'd never been allowed to handle during her marriage to Gerard. But independence in medieval society comes with significant costs and risks. Isabel's farm requires physical labor that she can't perform herself, and seasonal work that demands more hands than she can provide alone. She needs to hire help for planting, harvesting, and livestock management, which reduces her profits and creates ongoing personnel challenges. She also faces social pressure from community members who believe that women shouldn't live alone, and that remarriage is both morally appropriate and practically necessary for her long-term security. The tension builds as Isabel realizes that her decision about remarriage will affect not just her personal happiness, but also her economic survival and social standing. Remaining single means accepting ongoing financial challenges and social disapproval, but it also means preserving the autonomy and self-direction that she's learned to value. Remarrying means gaining economic security and social acceptability, but it also means surrendering the independence that widowhood has unexpectedly provided. The climax comes when Isabel receives a fourth marriage proposal, this one from Edmund, a widower whose first wife died in childbirth 3 years ago. Edmund's approach to courtship is completely different from the other suitors. Instead of focusing primarily on economic advantages and practical arrangements, he expresses genuine interest in getting to know Isabel as a person and building a relationship based on mutual respect and companionship, rather than just complementary household needs. Edmund suggests a courtship period during which they can spend time together and evaluate their compatibility before making any commitments about marriage. This approach appeals to Isabel because it acknowledges her right to choose based on personal preference rather than just family pressure and economic calculation. Edmund also indicates that he values her experience and competence, suggesting that any marriage between them would be a genuine partnership rather than a relationship where she would be expected to subordinate her judgment to his authority. The resolution comes when Isabel decides to pursue the relationship with Edmund, while maintaining her independence as long as possible. They begin spending time together during community gatherings and church events, having conversations about their respective experiences with marriage, widowhood, and managing households independently. Their courtship develops slowly and naturally, based on growing friendship and mutual respect rather than urgent economic necessity. Their relationship allows Isabel to explore the possibility of remarriage without immediately surrendering her autonomy. She learns that Edmund's approach to partnership is collaborative, rather than controlling, and that he values her opinions and experience, rather than expecting her to defer to his judgment automatically. She also discovers that companionship and emotional connection can enhance independence rather than undermining it, providing support and encouragement for personal growth rather than restrictions on individual development. Edmund, meanwhile, learns to appreciate Isabel's competence and self-reliance, recognizing that her experience managing Gerard's farm independently has made her a more capable and confident partner than she might have been during her first marriage. He understands that any successful relationship with Isabel will require treating her as an equal partner, rather than as a dependent who needs protection and guidance. The chapter concludes with Isabel and Edmund planning a marriage that will combine their households and resources, while preserving the autonomy and mutual respect that have made their courtship successful. They're approaching remarriage with realistic expectations based on their previous experiences, understanding that successful partnerships require ongoing negotiation and compromise, rather than romantic passion that overcomes all practical considerations. Their second-chance love story illustrates the unique opportunities that widowhood provided in medieval society for people to choose partners based on personal compatibility and mutual respect, rather than just family arrangements and economic necessity. Isabel has learned that love can be more satisfying when it develops between people who understand themselves and their needs, and that marriage works best when both partners bring experience, competence, and realistic expectations to their relationship. The stage is now set for exploring the final aspect of medieval romance, the complex web of superstitions, social rules, and cosmic considerations that governed who was allowed to love whom, examining how astrology, family lineage, social class, and divine will were all considered relevant factors in determining whether any particular romantic relationship was acceptable to the universe at large. You've made it this far, survived the contracts and courtships, navigated the chaperones, and perhaps even pulled off a dramatic barn elopement that will be whispered about for generations. But before you fall for someone new, before you even consider opening your heart to another person, you must ask yourself the most medieval question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of heart beating faster when someone smiled at you. It was a matter of stars, bloodlines, divine omens, and whether your grandmother saw a black cat crossing from left to right or right to left on the morning you first made eye contact with your potential beloved. Welcome to the complex universe of medieval romance, where falling in love required not just emotional courage, but also astronomical consultation, genealogical research, and careful attention to supernatural signs that might indicate whether the cosmos approved of your romantic choices. This wasn't paranoia or primitive superstition. This was a sophisticated system of belief that recognized love as a powerful force that could disrupt social order, economic stability, and divine plans if it wasn't properly regulated by higher authorities, both earthly and celestial. Let's begin with astrology, because before you kissed anyone, you might want to consult the local monk who doubled as an astrologer and could calculate whether your stars were compatible with your beloved's celestial influences. Are you a fiery Aries trying to romance a watery Cancer? That could spell disaster, especially if Venus is in retrograde and Mars is influencing your 7th house of partnership in ways that suggest conflict rather than harmony. Was your beloved born under an unlucky moon that indicates they're destined for tragic love affairs? Better to choose someone less cursed by astronomical circumstances, because love is difficult enough without planetary sabotage. Meet Brother Gregory, the monastery scholar who has spent 15 years studying the relationship between celestial movements and human romantic behavior. He's consulted by nervous parents, hopeful suitors, and occasionally by young people who've fallen in love and want to know whether the universe supports their emotional choices or whether they should redirect their affections towards someone with more astrologically compatible birth circumstances. Brother Gregory's consultations involve complex calculations that require knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and theological principles about divine will expressing itself through natural phenomena. He creates detailed charts mapping the positions of planets and stars at the time of each person's birth, then analyzes how those celestial influences might interact in a romantic partnership. His advice can make or break potential marriages, because few medieval families want to invest in relationships that the stars actively oppose. Then there are the bloodline considerations, because you couldn't marry your cousin, your second cousin, your fourth cousin twice removed, or anyone else who shared sufficient genetic material to violate church prohibitions against marriages between relatives. This requires creating family trees and researching genealogical connections that might not be immediately obvious, especially in small communities where everyone is related to everyone else in complicated ways that require careful documentation to untangle. The church maintained detailed records of family relationships, specifically to prevent inappropriate marriages between people who were too closely related. But the wealthy often bought special dispensations that allowed them to marry relatives who would otherwise be prohibited, because political and economic considerations sometimes outweighed theological concerns about genetic diversity and divine law. If you had enough money and political influence, you could essentially purchase permission to love someone the cosmos officially disapproved of. Social status created another layer of cosmic regulation, because nobles couldn't fall in love with peasants without it being declared either a divine miracle or a moral catastrophe. Cross-class romance was inherently suspect, suggesting that either supernatural forces were intervening in human affairs, or someone was violating the natural order that God had established to maintain social stability. Love that crossed economic boundaries required special justification and often resulted in social punishment for both parties involved. The superstitions and omens surrounding romantic relationships were elaborate and constantly evolving, creating a complex system of signs that could indicate whether any particular love affair was blessed or cursed by forces beyond human control. If a raven flew overhead while you were thinking about someone, that was generally considered a bad sign. If you dropped bread while looking at your crush during dinner, that suggested a cursed union that would bring misfortune to both families. If someone buried a charm under your doorstep, that might be intended to protect you from inappropriate suitors, or to sabotage your romantic prospects entirely, depending on who planted it and what they hope to accomplish. Enter Marguerite and Philippe, two young people who have fallen genuinely in love, but who face a comprehensive array of cosmic obstacles to their potential relationship. Marguerite is a merchant's daughter, born under what the local astrologer considers an unlucky conjunction of Saturn and Venus that suggests she's destined for romantic disappointment. Philippe is a minor noble whose family tree includes distant connections to Marguerite's lineage that might violate church regulations about marriage between relatives. Their romance also faces supernatural complications in the form of recurring omens that suggest divine disapproval of their relationship. On 3 separate occasions, when they've tried to meet privately, unexpected storms have forced them to seek shelter separately. A barn cat that Marguerite has been feeding for months suddenly refused to eat from her hands the day after Philippe first kissed her. Most ominously, the village wise woman claims to have seen both their faces in a dream that ended with flooding and crop failure, which she interprets as a warning that their marriage would bring disaster to the entire community. The conflict intensifies when both families consult multiple sources of supernatural guidance and receive contradictory advice about whether Marguerite and Philippe should pursue their relationship. Brother Gregory's astrological analysis suggests that their birth charts are fundamentally incompatible, and that marriage between them would result in ongoing conflict and eventual separation. But Father Benedict, the parish priest, argues that their obvious affection for each other and their compatible personalities suggest divine blessing rather than cosmic disapproval. The local wise woman, consulted secretly by Marguerite's mother, performs a complex divination ritual involving herbs, candle flames, and readings of natural signs that produces ambiguous results open to multiple interpretations. Some elements of the ritual suggest that Marguerite and Philippe are destined for each other, and that opposing their love would anger supernatural forces that protect true romantic connections. Other aspects of the divination indicate that their relationship challenges social order in ways that could bring misfortune to their families and community. The crisis deepens when the families discover that their genealogical research has revealed a complicated ancestral connection that might violate church law. Marguerite and Philippe share a great-great-grandmother, making them fourth cousins, which places them in a category where marriage might be prohibited, depending on how strictly the local church hierarchy interprets canonical regulations about consanguinity. The relationship isn't clearly forbidden, but it's not clearly permitted either, requiring official investigation and possibly special dispensation from ecclesiastical authorities. The climax comes when Marguerite and Philippe decide to seek guidance directly from the regional bishop, who has authority to grant dispensations for marriages that fall into canonical gray areas. Their petition requires them to present evidence that their love serves divine purposes rather than merely satisfying personal desires, and that their marriage would contribute to community welfare rather than disrupting social stability. The bishop's investigation involves examining their family trees, consulting astrological charts, reviewing the reported supernatural omens, and interviewing community members about the couple's character and the likely consequences of their marriage. The process takes months and requires testimony from multiple witnesses who can speak to both the authenticity of their affection and the potential social impact of allowing them to marry despite the various cosmic obstacles. The resolution comes when the bishop determines that Marguerite and Philippe's relationship, while canonically complicated and astrologically challenging, demonstrates the kind of genuine spiritual connection that suggests divine approval despite superficial supernatural obstacles. He grants a special dispensation that allows them to marry, but only after performing penance for pursuing a relationship that has caused community controversy, and only with the understanding that their marriage will be monitored to ensure it produces the social benefits that justify overriding cosmic concerns. Their wedding becomes a community celebration that acknowledges both the triumph of true love and the importance of respecting supernatural guidance in romantic matters. The ceremony includes special prayers asking for divine protection against the negative influences suggested by astrological analysis, and the feast features rituals designed to counteract any lingering supernatural disapproval of their union. The chapter concludes with Marguerite and Philippe beginning their married life with a deep appreciation for the complex forces that medieval society believed influenced romantic relationships. They've learned that love in their world requires not just emotional compatibility, but also cosmic permission, social approval, and spiritual blessing from multiple sources of authority, both earthly and divine. Their love story represents the medieval understanding that individual romantic desires must be balanced against larger concerns about social stability, divine will, and supernatural influence. They've discovered that true love can overcome cosmic obstacles, but only when it demonstrates genuine spiritual value and social benefit that justifies challenging the natural order that governs human relationships. Because whether medieval or modern, the human heart remains wonderfully disobedient, finding ways to love despite rules, restrictions, and cosmic disapproval. And sometimes, when love proves itself worthy through persistence, courage, and genuine spiritual connection, even the universe learns to approve of romance that initially seemed impossible. In the end, medieval love stories remind us that the heart's rebellion against authority, whether parental, social, or cosmic, has always been both humanity's greatest risk and its most beautiful adventure. And that's how our medieval ancestors turned love into an art form more complex than rocket science. If this made your dating life seem simple in comparison, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which medieval dating strategy you'd actually try today. Subscribe to Boring Sleepless History for more stories that are anything but boring. We've got Vikings, Renaissance scandals, and ancient mysteries that'll keep your mind busy whether you're trying to fall asleep or procrastinating at 3 a.m. Next up, Viking wedding traditions that make modern bachelor parties look like tea parties. Sweet dreams, and remember, at least you don't need your parents' permission to swipe right.